Welcome to Monday Morning Coffee with Inside the Firm. Each week, our hosts will be interviewing local, regional, and national business leaders to give you an inside peek into how they lead their business to success in the ever-competitive business climate.
Welcome to Monday Morning Coffee with Inside the Firm. Today I have a very special guest. John David Graham is the founder of Good Samaritan Home, a housing and mentoring program helping men and women restart their lives after prison. Prior to that, he was a door-to-door salesman, children's home counselor, substitute school teacher, truck driver, fireman, building contractor, minister, and journalist. So as you can see, he has a lot of life experience, and sometimes the road home takes many twists and turns to develop what John calls calloused hands and a tender heart, which he used to write his award-winning debut novel, Running as Fast as I Can. John, welcome to the show.
I'm very glad to be here this morning.
You had such a phenomenal bio. I had to have you on the show. I just love, and you know, it sounds like you're a man of God, and have done so many different things. I do a ton of different things too, and I just love picking people's brains who are much like myself, but also very different. So before we get into what you do now and the book and everything else, tell us how you got here. You know, are you from a family of entrepreneurs? Like, what kind of led you down to where you're at now?
Now, actually, just the opposite, because I grew up in the mill towns around Pittsburgh. So we grew up in the 50s and 60s, and you were expected just to go to high school and go to the mill, spend your 30 years, spend your nights in the bars, and then you retire. Hopefully not in a drunken stupor, and maybe your kids will stay out of jail. And our expectations were pretty static because, at least in my family, it was not an abusive situation, but we were simply ignored, which I think was very common among my group. And I looking back now, when I go to a high school reunion from, say, 50 years ago, and I see families, classmates who were brought up with expectations. Their parents were professional and they were expected to be college graduates and to be professional themselves. I had none of that. So you described a very eclectic background, but what I call it is a very difficult job situation where I couldn't find where I fit. I went from job to job to job and passed up some seemingly good jobs like being a fireman, but I was never satisfied because I had no structure. And that's fine when you're single. I was homeless at one point when I was single, and I could accept that. It's hard on me, but I had no family. But then when I got married and had two children, and we started moving from state to state, and we were near homeless many times, that's when you have to really rethink your life. And at 53, when everybody else should have been retiring, my wife and I, and she stuck with me, by the way, we said, maybe we can help somebody else who's struggling more than we have, because I remembered all of those difficult times. And so we ended up pulling what little money we had and remodeling our house as a shelter. And we took in strangers to help people who were struggling more than us. And one thing led to another, and the Department of Corrections said, we have people who are double homeless. They're coming out of prison and they have nowhere to go. They're low risk, and if they don't get housing, they'll be back in jail. So we ended up taking in a man from prison and then another and another. Mm-hmm. And Good Samaritan Home now has 19 houses, and we have 10 staff, and we have housed and helped almost 2,500 men and women restart their lives. So what I thought to be was all the mistakes I made actually came together to help me help others. So I see that as God's grace.
Yeah, it's providence, right? I mean, every time.
Yes.
I mean, I live my life philosophily by the law of polarity, which is, there's a negative and a positive to everything. And whenever the negatives come, it's like, I'm thankful that God is going to set me up with a positive after this, but that there's always a lesson to learn from the negative, or something you're supposed to take away in that way. And the fingerprint's very obvious to me. Do you have any, without naming names, do you have any success stories that you could share about your residents?
Well, I have what comes to mind right off the bat is the first resident we had was a man out of Cleveland, and we're in a rural part of Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
and it's predominantly white. And here's a black man coming from Cleveland,
Mm.
and he was obviously nervous, and the city was nervous, and he stayed with us for a better part of a year, and that was 24 years ago. And last week he called me, and he said, "How you doing?" I hear from him once a year. He said, I just read your book and I have some advice for you. So, which is typical of Reggie. Uh, but he's got a family, he's got children, he's not been in trouble, and he's stayed out of jail and he's been a taxpayer instead of a tax burden. And he made it coming from a wholly different world.
Mm-hmm.
And the other example I want to bring is Jimmy, who was just the opposite. He was local, he was 67 years old, he was schizophrenic, and he was almost dead when they found him in his truck that had broken down in the middle of winter.
Oh my gosh.
And the hospital called us and said, "Can you help him?"
Mm-hmm.
And we did, if the hospital would guarantee he would take his psych meds. And Jimmy stayed with us for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and eventually he stayed 14 years with us. And he was 81 years old when he passed away in our house. And he said just before he died, this was the only home I ever had
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
because
Thank you
he'd been
for
on the street all his life because of his mental illness.
yeah, yeah. Has anybody tried to replicate what you're doing? Or are you mentoring people to do that? I mean, homelessness is a giant problem all over the United States. It got even worse during COVID and, sort of after COVID.
Well, part of, all those detours I took, they came together to help me because I was able to connect with a chaplain in the Ohio prison system because I was trying to see if I could help in any way with somebody coming from prison. And they had a program called uh, independent housing where they were looking for shelter homes that were stable enough that they could refer people. So I became a housing partner for the Department of Correction. And instead of the state having to pay somebody or pay $109 a day for somebody to be in prison, if they're in the street, in the community, in a stable housing environment, they can get a job, they can pay their child support, they can pay taxes, they can buy goods in the community, and they are not charged while they're with us. The state will compensate us with a contract. So we actually run it like a business, but yet it's a nonprofit business.
Mm,
And so the residents win, we win, the state wins,
yeah.
and we are implementing, we're one of several partners in the state. And that's where the 19 houses came because one house, one bed became two, three, four houses. And I will tell you, there was a great deal of risk, of course,
Oh,
buying a
sure.
house and remodeling it. But that's where my background came in because one of
Hmm.
my jobs I had done was a building contractor. So I had no money, but I had skills. So I would remodel these houses.
What kind of resistance do you face if, like, let's say you're gonna do house 20. I mean, what kind of resistance have you seen in the past that maybe you're still seeing in the future if you continue down this road from the community?
Initially, we were in a rural town northwest of Dayton. And small towns tend to be very insular. They know what you did in first grade. They remind you of it
Yeah.
regularly.
Hmm.
And so I thought that welcoming Reggie, our first resident, would be a wonderful thing and people would want to support it. And the first thing that happened was petitions were passed. There was calls to the city hall. There were ordinances passed. People were sending letters to the editor. There were threats. It got so bad at one point that I had police protection going to one of the city council meetings. It took us three lawsuits and 7 years to finally get through that. And the whole time, not only did we stay open and keep operating, but we kept growing as a statement of faith, I suppose you call it. But we felt that it was so important to do what we were doing, and as long as we could legally continue, we did. And eventually, not only did the issue work itself out in court, but the neighborhood people who at one point were waving at us with one finger now we're using all their fingers. because being a good neighbor and over time and not living into their fears, we were able to win them over.
Oh, amazing. Yeah,
Yeah. It was a process. It's
I'm
it's
sure.
still a process.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. As an architect and a builder, then I can resonate with that because sometimes there's typologies we're bringing into neighborhoods that they're afraid of, and I think of a lot of it's just the unknown where people are.
Absolutely, absolutely. A good example is currently in Springfield, Ohio, which is only an hour away from where our houses are located. The people are afraid of others,
Hmm.
and it became a political football. And I understood very clearly what they were going through because you tend to say if something is foreign, particularly if it has a different language, then you factor in racial issues. Fear breeds fear, and it can get hostile. At one point, we had a fella who tried to stab me in front of the courthouse,
Oh,
and a mentally ill person, of course.
yeah, yeah,
So, but again, um, we started moving our houses towards Dayton and growing in that area because it's a much bigger area. But more important, we moved into the what we call the ghetto, the area where the most need was, and we started buying houses during the recession. So we buy a duplex that needed a great deal of work and fix it up, and the neighborhood would start to improve around us because of that. And so now in a larger metropolitan area, we are seen as a much more positive neighbor than we were in a small rural community.
oh, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
now we could afford to do that now. We couldn't initially because we had to use my house where I was.
yeah, yeah, I get that. Uh, Sort of a curveball question, but maybe it's related. You lived through the political, social upheaval of the '60s, and I'm curious, like how that affected you, and how does it affect you today? You have such a varied background.
That's a good question. I grew up, I wasn't involved in civil rights issues, but very aware of them.
Yeah.
And I was very aware of, I still remember the afternoon when John Kennedy was shot. I was in biology class,
Hmm.
and we closed down all our activities that weekend, and we felt disoriented. That's the best way to describe it. We just didn't know what to say or do. And whether your politics are left or right, it didn't matter.
Hmm.
And then we saw all those protests. And when I was in college, we saw campuses being shut down. Uh, it was we've forgotten today, but there were more bombings in that period in campuses, particularly in draft centers and in college campuses and protests. There were more violence then than there is today. But I will say this, that 1968 reminds me a great deal of what we are seeing today. And I think part of it is that we're going through a cycle.
Yeah.
Children don't know what their parents went through, and grandchildren have no idea.
Yeah.
And so the grandchildren now are doing the protesting that we did back in 1968. And what personal experience was, it was May 4th, 1970. I went to Kent State to see a girl,
Mm.
and she wasn't there. So I went on to Ohio State, and on the travels, I heard there had been a shooting at Kent State. The National Guard had, in a protest, had killed 4 students. So we stopped at Ohio State campus and got involved as a witness, I suppose, in a protest on that very afternoon, knowing that there had been violence, had been shootings, and the National Guard surrounded us. People were protesting, and they had their guns pointed at us. And I thought, this was the dumbest thing I ever did. But like most people during that period, there's a lot of observers, a lot of people just caught up in the drama of the moment. But closer heads prevailed, and calmer heads prevailed, and nobody was killed that afternoon where I was. But what it did was that event, that day, so traumatized me that I had, at that point, I was planning to go to the Air Force. I had been accepted as in officer candidate school. After that day, I not only canceled that, but I never entered a voting booth for the next 30 years
Wow.
because you take that incident, then we went into Watergate, which made
Mm.
it a whole different issue.
Hmm.
So it was an extraordinarily traumatic and disorienting time. I think it had a lot to do with my career instability.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, you seem awfully grounded now. I mean, as a man you were able to write the book, let's kind of move into that. Running as fast as I can, the title of your book, it's been called Everyone's Story. Why do you think that is?
Well, initially, what happened when I was going to the city council, try to present the reasons why we were doing what we were doing, I had reams of data because the research is very clear that if you present a safe environment, if you eliminate homelessness coming from prison, you make the community safer. But nobody was listening. So what I decided to do was, if I could tell that story of second chances in a way that people can connect with, and so I took not my story, but it was my outline, and I made a fictional character, Daniel Robinson, who went along my Forrest Gump type journey. And I brought in this whole concept of second chances into it because Daniel is not coming from prison. He's just you and I who just don't. He came from an abusive family. He came, basically, he grew up on his own and he had no direction. So he made a lot of mistakes and he hurt a lot of people because he just didn't know what to do. But in the end, with community, with help, with it's not a religious book, but there's certainly a spiritual overtone. The idea of second chances is that legally and morally, we all are looking for a second chance in life. And Daniel's story is one that readers writing back now have said, I can identify with Daniel. I've been there. I understand Daniel. And the truth is that I've read that story 100 times, and I still there are moments where I get emotional reading it because the this idea of the mistakes he made. I'll read the story and I'll say, Daniel, don't do that, and I know he's going to do it. And I had one man who was 91 years old who said he couldn't put the book down. He was reading at 3 a.m.
Amazing.
And that to me is you're not just telling facts, you're telling a story that pull
Yeah.
people in. That's
Yeah.
what I wanted to do.
Oh, good. But I mean, that's the best way people learn is it's then it's not a lecture. They're not like reading a lecture, just people just talking at them. You're involved in the story. Storytelling is so powerful. How does it feel to go from I know you were I think you were rejected like 200 times by publishers.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then you won 25 book awards. What's that like?
Well, but I wanted to take those awards and put it in an envelope and send it to all those agents in New York and say, take that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that.
But what I've learned is that publishing is a business.
Mm.
And ironically, most books don't sell. The best most books, so the majority of books sell no more than 250 copies in their lifetime. So there's no money in it for publishers. So they look at my story from an unknown person, telling an unknown story. I'm not John Grisham. I'm not Kristen Hanna. I can't guarantee you that you'll get a 500,000 readers out there. But I felt like I was tilting at windmills, trying to get somebody to recognize this story. And in fact, it got to the point where I expected rejections.
Hmm.
And that's what worried me the most because I began to think like I was a loser. So what I did was I got hold of my attorney, got hold of my accountant, and I formed my own publishing company called Don Quixote Press
Mm.
because we tilt at windmills passionately. And then I hired a publicist and I had worked with an editor for 2 years. So we felt to be a story that was worth telling. And we started working for the past year, and one thing led to another. And we use the 250 copies as our baseline, and we've sold over 6,000 copies. And it's garnered now 26 awards because one came in last week. So that to me, there's a lesson in it for me because now when I get an email from some sort of contest submission, I expect to win something. My mindset is now expecting to be a winner. And that to me is it's like we had with Good Samaritan Home. We expected we will win this case.
Hmm.
We expect we'll get this house remodeled in time. We expect you to make it through your rehabilitation process.
Hmm. Yeah, I love your mindset. Thank you for unpacking that. What is the best advice you would give for someone who wants to start over late in their career? Like 40s, 50s, and they're just starting over. I mean, this is probably a question for my girlfriend who's literally doing that right now at 44, as an architect. She's kind of went in and out of academia, and now she's maybe going back to private practice.
Well, I was 53 when I started Good Samaritan Home. I was 61 when I finished my doctorate, and I was 75 when I finally published my novel I had been wanting to write for 50 years. So I would say what I learned was you look on Facebook, you look on TV, you look at all what I call the hard bodies. All these young people like Elon Musk or like
Mm.
when he was first started with PayPal, I believe it
Hmm.
was. And then there's Mark Zuckerberg, who was 19. And you say, why can't I be successful? But they are an anomaly. They are extraordinarily unusual, but we think they're normal. And they ran a sprint and they won the sprint and they lucked into that through a series of events. But you and I are running a marathon and we're going to have to run hard every day. And some of us have to run to even find the starting line because we're so far behind, we can't even see it. So I would tell your girlfriend, and I would tell everybody out there that it's a marathon. Just keep running. And if I can find my niche at 53 and again at 75,
Yeah.
you can find yours at 44.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to think lately that you have four lives. One from like 1 to 20, 20 to 20 to 40, 40 to 40 to 60, and then 60 to 80. And it kind of ties into when you were talking about the your experience with the social upheaval and maybe we're going through this cycle. Like I don't know if you've ever heard of the fourth turning and that there's a book series about it. But basically the idea is about every 20 years. Um, and there's the first cycles to first 20, 20 to 40 and all of that. And you have these big social upheavals that happen. And I think the average lifespan of a human is about 80 years. And that's where you're at too. Yeah. So there's always opportunity for reinvention. I mean, you're such a good example of that, John. I don't even know if do you ever think when you first started all this that you'd be an award-winning author?
No, I just wanted to tell the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I published an academic book initially after with my doctorate, and three people read it because it was all data, and so I wanted to tell the story that people would read and enjoy. And here's the best part is that my granddaughter, who's only 13 years old, now has become one of my what we call beta readers.
Mm.
She'll read my articles that I'm writing for Substack or for Facebook, and because she's an aspiring writer.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm able to pass on, this is where our common ground is. I can pass on something that she seems to have a knack for, and I can encourage her in ways that I never had growing up.
Amazing.
But uh, I think the key element, a good example of this idea of never quit running
Yeah.
is that I saw an ad in the paper that Harrison Ford, his series 1923 television series, was looking for walk-on actors. So, and they were in San Antonio where I was. And so I put my name in, and I'll be darned if they didn't hire me.
Mm.
So I'd never been an actor, don't want to be an actor, but they hired me to be in this series as a walk-in. So I went to Austin, got fitted, and officially I became an actor, even though they cut my scene because they paid me $32 for my day. And the point is that don't be afraid, no matter what your age, to try something outside the box.
Yeah, 100%.
Always.
Yeah. John, we're running up on the half hour here. You've been such a great guest. I have two questions I ask everybody. First one is knowing what you know now, and if you could go back in time to when you first started um, your Good Samaritan home, your homes, what is one piece of advice you'd give your former self?
Well, the trouble with being a loner is you tend to make decisions in the dark. So I would try to make decisions that I make today, 20 years ago, by bringing in smarter people than me, just give
Mm.
me advice.
Yeah, a mentor. Yeah, 100%. I'm with.
Absolutely a mentor. That's the theme of the book, by the way, having a mentor.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Well, I think that's a great place for us to sort of begin the end of this interview on. If people want to get in touch with you, John, if they want to help out in some kind of way or just link up with you social media and obviously get the book, where can they find and follow you and get in touch?
Easiest way is just go to johndavidgraham.com and that'll link to Good Samaritan Home. It'll link to Amazon. You can even send me an email through that site. Be glad to talk to you.
Beautiful. John, God bless your work. Merry Christmas to you. And thank you for being the guest on the show. We appreciate your time.
Oh, listen, my pleasure. Thank you so much.